What happens when a unit is written off? When headquarters logs them as presumed lost, when the main army withdraws and leaves them to their fate, and when the only orders remaining are to fight to the last man and the last bullet? This is the story of 144 Allied soldiers at a remote desert outpost called Bir Hakeim. Not the entire garrison of 3,700, that story is legendary in its own right. This is the story of a single company cut off from the main defensive box, surrounded by Rommel's crack troops, and left to survive for 3 days and 3 nights without a single drop of water in the furnace of the Libyan desert. The date is early June 1942. The temperature on the stone and sand of the desert floor regularly exceeds 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And these men, a mix of French Foreign Legionnaires, colonial infantry, and a handful of British support personnel, are about to discover what the human body is capable of enduring when survival hangs by the thinnest of threads. What happened next would defy logic, rewrite the rules of desert warfare, and change the course of the North African campaign. To understand how 144 men found themselves in this impossible situation, we must first understand Bir Hakeim itself. The name in Arabic means wise well, a reference to an ancient Roman cistern that had provided water to caravans crossing this barren wasteland for centuries. By 1942, it was little more than a ruined Ottoman fort, a few concrete shacks, and a deep well that barely produced enough brackish water to sustain life. But on the military maps of General Erwin Rommel, this insignificant dot in the desert had become an obstacle of monumental importance. The Ghazala line, as the Allies had constructed it, stretched south from the Mediterranean coast for some 50 miles. It was not a continuous trench line, but rather a series of fortified boxes, each defended by a brigade-strength force, surrounded by minefields and barbed wire, with mobile armored forces positioned to counterattack any breakthrough. At the southernmost tip of this line sat Bir Hakeim, and holding this position was the 1st Free French Brigade under Brigadier General Marie-Pierre Koenig, 3,700 men who had refused to accept the humiliation of France's surrender in 1940. They were an army in exile, fighting to restore the honor of their nation. Among them were veterans of the Norwegian campaign, colonial troops from Chad and the Congo, and the men of the 13th Demi-Brigade of the French Foreign Legion, perhaps the most storied regiment in one of the world's most legendary fighting forces. Her commander was 24-year-old First Lieutenant Robert J. Evans, a former accountant from Ohio. Unlike the Hollywood image of the dashing pilot, Evans was quiet, methodical, and carried the weight of 9 other men on his shoulders. His crew was a mix of veterans and replacements. His co-pilot, 22-year-old Lieutenant Bill Pearson, was on his 7th mission. On the morning of May 26, 1942, Rommel launched his offensive. His plan was audacious, typical of the Desert Fox. He would take his panzer divisions on a wide, sweeping hook around the southern flank of the Ghazala line, pass directly through Bir. He did not, however, count on the French. The fighting at Bir Hakeim would rage for 16 days. The Italian Ariete Division, sent in to crush the French on the first morning, lost 32 tanks in the minefields and withdrew in disarray. Rommel himself later wrote of the extraordinary toughness of the defense. But by June 9th, the situation had become desperate. The garrison was running low on ammunition, food, and most critically, water. The main British forces had withdrawn east toward Egypt, and in the chaos of the battle, one company, 144 men, had become completely cut off from the main defensive position. The company held a section of the outer perimeter, a series of shallow trenches and weapons pits carved into the rock-hard desert floor. They had been in position for 2 weeks, sleeping in their holes, fighting off attacks by day, and repairing their defenses by night. Their position was approximately 200 yards forward of the main French line, a salient that had proven difficult to reinforce when the Axis forces tightened their grip. By the evening of June 9th, the situation had become critical. The previous night's supply run had not reached them. German and Italian patrols had infiltrated the minefields and were now operating between their position and the main defensive box. At 2100 hours, a runner reached them with a message from battalion headquarters: "Hold your position. Resupply impossible tonight. Conserve ammunition. Expect enemy probing attacks at dawn." The men checked their water bottles. The company had started the day with partial rations, approximately half a canteen per man, about 1 pint. By nightfall, most of that was gone. The heat of the day had been brutal, and the constant physical exertion of manning the defenses had driven men to drink more than they should have. The company commander, a Legion captain whose name history has recorded only as Captain DeLange, gathered his section leaders. "We have no water," he told them. "Not a drop. We must hold until the situation changes. No one is coming tonight." The men settled into their positions as the desert night descended. The temperature dropped rapidly, as it always does in the Sahara, from over 100 degrees during the day to perhaps 50 degrees by midnight. The men shivered in their sweat-soaked uniforms, the chill a cruel irony after the furnace of the day. At 023 hours, the Germans came. A company of the 90th Light Division, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, had found a path through the minefield. They advanced in silence, their officers hoping to overrun the forward French positions before the defenders could react. But the legionnaires were not sleeping. Despite their thirst, despite their exhaustion, they were watching. The first shots rang out at a range of just 50 yards. A German soldier stepped on an empty ration tin, the clatter echoing in the stillness, and suddenly the night erupted. The Legion's machine guns opened fire. The 25mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister shots swept the approach. The attack was beaten back with heavy losses on both sides. But when dawn broke on June 10th, the company's situation had become even more desperate. They had expended precious ammunition. They had taken casualties. 7 men killed, 12 wounded, and they still had no water. The wounded cried out for something to drink, their bodies already beginning to shut down from dehydration. Captain DeLange made the hardest decision of his military career. He ordered the wounded's remaining water collected and redistributed to the men who could still fight. The wounded would have to endure. The morning of June 10th brought a heat that seemed to radiate from the very stones. By 0900 hours, the temperature had already passed 100 degrees. The men lay in their trenches, trying to move as little as possible, conserving every drop of moisture in their bodies. Their tongues began to swell. Their lips cracked and bled. When they tried to speak, their voices came out as harsh whispers. At 1100 hours, a German staff car approached under a white flag. An officer stepped out, accompanied by a French-speaking interpreter. "General Rommel sends his compliments," the interpreter called out. "You have fought bravely, but you are surrounded. You have no water. Surrender now, and you will be treated with the honors due to such brave soldiers." Captain DeLange's reply was not recorded in official histories, but those who survived remembered it as something unrepeatable in polite company. The German officer shrugged, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. 20 minutes later, the shells began to fall. The artillery barrage that afternoon was the heaviest the company had yet experienced. German 105mm howitzers and Italian 75mm guns pounded the position for 3 solid hours. The men pressed themselves into the bottoms of their trenches, praying that the next shell would not land directly on top of them. The concussions shook the earth like earthquakes. The air filled with dust and smoke and the screams of dying men. By 1500 hours, the barrage lifted. The company had suffered again. 3 more dead, 5 more wounded, and still no water. The wounded were now beginning to die from dehydration as much as from their wounds. Their bodies, already stressed by trauma, could not compensate for the lack of fluid. One by one, they slipped into unconsciousness. At 1600 hours, the infantry attack came. German and Italian troops advanced from 3 directions, clearly hoping that the bombardment and the thirst had broken the defenders' will. They were wrong. The legionnaires waited until the attackers were within 50 yards, then rose from their trenches and opened fire with every weapon they had. The machine guns chattered. The riflemen picked their targets with the precision of men who had trained for years in the art of war. The anti-tank guns fired their canister rounds into the packed ranks. The attack faltered, then broke. The attackers fell back, leaving dozens of dead and wounded in the open ground before the French trenches. But the cost had been high. The company had now lost nearly a third of its effective strength, and there were still more Germans coming. Rommel, they knew, would not leave this pocket of resistance threatening his flank. As the sun began to set on June 10th, the second day without water, Captain DeLange took stock. He had perhaps 100 men still capable of fighting. He had less than half his original ammunition. He had no communications with the main force, and he had no water. The nearest source was the main well at Bir Hakeim, controlled by Koenig's headquarters, nearly a mile away across ground now crawling with German patrols. The men's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Dehydration was now affecting their judgment. Some men hallucinated, seeing pools of water where there was only rock. Others became lethargic, unwilling to move even when ordered. The captain knew that if they didn't get water by the following night, there would be no one left to fight. That night, he made a decision. He would send a patrol through the German lines to reach headquarters and beg for water. If they could get through, if they could bring back even a few canteens, the company might survive until the expected breakout. If they failed, well, no one spoke of that possibility. At 2300 hours on June 10th, a volunteer patrol of 6 men slipped out of the French lines. They carried nothing but their weapons and empty canteens, as many as they could carry. Their mission, reach Koenig's headquarters, explain the situation, and return with water before dawn. The night was moonless, a blessing for men trying to move unseen through enemy positions. The patrol crawled on their bellies through the minefields, feeling ahead of them with their bare hands for the telltale pressure of anti-personnel mines. Twice they heard German voices, sentries chatting quietly, smoking cigarettes whose smell carried on the night air. Twice they froze, barely breathing, until the voices moved away. It took them 4 hours to cover less than a mile. At 0300 hours, they reached the main defensive box. They were challenged by French sentries who nearly shot them before recognizing the uniforms. Within minutes, they were standing before General Koenig's operations officer. The news they brought was grim. 100 men, the patrol leader reported. Maybe less now. No water since the 9th. Wounded dying, ammunition low. We can hold 1 more day, maybe 2, but without water. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The operations officer shook his head. We have no water to send. The main garrison is down to half rations ourselves. The well is barely producing, and the Germans have cut all the approaches. We couldn't get a supply column through if we had the water. The patrol leader stared at him. Then my men are going to die. We're all going to die if we don't break out soon, the officer replied. General Koenig is planning a breakout for tomorrow night, the night of June 11th. All forces. If your company can hold until then, you can break out with the rest of us. Hold until then, the patrol leader repeated, with no water, through another day of this heat. That's the order. The patrol gathered as many canteens as they could carry, perhaps 50, each filled with the precious liquid, and began the journey back. But the return trip was even more dangerous. Dawn was approaching, and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. They moved faster than they should have, knowing they had to reach the company before full daylight exposed them. They were 200 yards from the company's position when the Germans spotted them. A machine gun opened fire from a hidden position. 2 men fell immediately, their bodies tumbling into a shell crater. The remaining 4 dove for cover, the canteens clanking against the rocks. For the next hour, they were pinned down, unable to move, as the sun rose and the temperature began its inexorable climb. Back in the company's trenches, Captain Delange waited. Dawn came and went with no sign of his patrol. He assumed they had been captured or killed. The hope that had sustained him through the night began to fade. June 11th, the 3rd day without water, dawned clear and brutal. The temperature at 0800 hours was already 95 degrees. By noon, it would pass 120. The men lay in their trenches, no longer speaking, no longer moving. Some had torn their uniforms trying to find some relief from the heat. Others had stopped sweating entirely, a sign that their bodies had no more moisture to give. At 0900 hours, the German artillery opened fire again. This time, the men barely reacted. They were too weak to seek shelter, too dehydrated to care. Shells fell around them, but they lay where they were, waiting for the end. The attack came at 1100 hours. German infantry advanced cautiously. Expecting resistance, they found a scene that even battle-hardened veterans found disturbing. French soldiers, barely conscious, still trying to raise their rifles. Men whose lips were black with dried blood, whose eyes were sunken in their sockets, who could no longer speak but only whisper, and yet they were still fighting. A legionnaire with a shattered leg propped himself against the trench wall and fired his rifle one-handed. Another, too weak to stand, pulled the pin on a grenade and rolled it toward the advancing Germans. The attack was beaten back, but only just. The company had perhaps 50 men still capable of resistance. The rest were dead, dying, or simply too far gone from dehydration to move. Captain Delange crawled from trench to trench, checking on his men, trying to give them hope. But he had no hope to give. The patrol had not returned. There was no water. There was only the heat and the dust and the waiting. At 1400 hours, a miracle occurred. The 4 surviving members of the patrol crawled into the trench line. They had waited out the daylight in a shell crater, moving only when the German patrols had passed. They had dragged the canteens with them, 38 of them, still full of water. When they collapsed into the trench, the water was passed around. Men who had given up hope wept as the liquid touched their lips. Captain Delange gave strict orders, small sips only. The body deprived of water for so long could not handle too much at once. But for the first time in 3 days, the men had hope. They had water, and they had a plan. That night, they would break out with the rest of the garrison. They would not die in this God-forsaken place. The plan for the breakout was audacious, perhaps insane. The entire Bir Hakeim garrison, some 3,000 men still capable of fighting, would attempt to slip through the German lines under cover of darkness. They would leave behind their wounded, their heavy equipment, and any vehicle that could not move. They would travel light, fast, and silent, and they would rendezvous with British forces some 30 miles to the west. For the 144, now reduced to perhaps 100 effectives, the plan was even more desperate. Their position was the farthest from the rendezvous point. They would have to cross more than a mile of enemy-held territory just to reach the main force, then continue with them through the German lines. But staying was not an option. By morning, without more water, they would all be dead. At 2200 hours, the company began to move. They left their wounded behind, a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives, but one that was necessary. The wounded understood. They knew that the able-bodied had to escape, had to live to fight another day. Some shook hands. Some simply nodded. A few, those who could still hold a rifle, volunteered to stay and fight a delaying action, to draw German attention away from the escaping column. The column moved out, single file, following a path marked by a scout who had spent the evening hours crawling through the German positions, marking safe routes with strips of white cloth. The men moved as silently as ghosts, their feet wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of boots on stone. They passed within 20 yards of a German machine gun position. They could hear the sentries talking, hear the clink of mess tins, smell the coffee they were brewing. One man stumbled, his foot catching on a rock. He froze. The sentries kept talking. The column moved on. At 23:30 hours, they linked up with the main force. General Koenig himself was there, moving among the men, speaking quietly, offering encouragement. When he saw Captain Delange, he stopped. "Your men?" he asked. 70 left, Delange replied. "Maybe 80. I don't know exactly." Koenig nodded. "They will be remembered," he said, and then he moved on. The breakout began at midnight. The column moved forward, thousands of men in a long, snaking line. They passed through gaps in the minefields that had been marked by scouts. They crossed roads that were patrolled by German vehicles. They moved through wadis and over ridges, always heading west, always silent, always watching. At 0200 hours, the Germans discovered the escape. Flares lit up the sky. Machine guns opened fire. Vehicles roared to life. The column dissolved into chaos. Men ran in every direction, firing as they went. Trucks that had been moving with lights off suddenly switched on their headlights and raced for the British lines, German bullets pinging off their armor. Captain Delange's company scattered. Some men were cut down immediately, their bodies falling in the desert sand. Others made it to the rendezvous point, only to find the British not yet there. They lay in the open, waiting, praying, as German patrols searched for them. By dawn on June 12th, the survivors began to straggle into the British lines. They came in groups of 2 and 3, staggering out of the desert like ghosts. Some had walked 20 miles with no food and little water. Others had been picked up by British patrols. And some, the unlucky ones, had been captured and sent to prisoner of war camps. Of the 144 men who had been cut off and surrounded, only 47 reached the British lines. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. But those 47 had survived 3 days without water, had held their position against overwhelming odds, and had broken out through enemy lines to fight another day. The Battle of Bir Hakeim ended on June 11, 1942, with the breakout of the Free French garrison, but its consequences reverberated far beyond that single night in the desert. The 47 survivors of the surrounded company were evacuated to the rear, where they were treated for severe dehydration, malnutrition, and combat exhaustion. Many would return to fight again in Tunisia, in Italy, in France itself. Captain Delange would later receive the Croix de la Libération for his leadership during the siege. Several of his men received similar honors. The strategic impact of Bir Hakeim cannot be overstated. The 16-day defense had delayed Rommel's advance by 2 critical weeks. Those weeks allowed the British Eighth Army to regroup, to receive reinforcements, and to prepare defensive positions at El Alamein. When Rommel finally reached those positions in July 1942, he found a waiting army instead of a broken one. The First Battle of El Alamein stopped his advance. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October destroyed his army. General Koenig, in his after-action report, specifically mentioned the isolated company. These men, he wrote, held a position that military logic said was untenable. Without water, without hope of reinforcement, without any prospect of relief, they fought with a determination that has few equals in the history of the French army. They are an example to us all. Winston Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, declared that the Free French had proven themselves worthy of the glorious traditions of the French army. And General de Gaulle, in a message to Koenig, said simply, "Sachez et dites à vos troupes que toute la France vous regarde et que vous êtes son orgueil." Know and tell your troops that all of France is watching you and that you are her pride. The exact casualty figures for the surrounded company will never be known with certainty. The chaos of the breakout, the confusion of the desert battlefield, and the loss of records in subsequent campaigns make precise numbers impossible. But historians estimate that of the 144 men who were cut off on June 9th, approximately 30 were killed in action, 50 were wounded, 17 died of dehydration or wounds before the breakout, and 47 escaped. The rest were captured. For the French Foreign Legion, Bir Hakeim became one of its most sacred battle honors. The 13th Demi-Brigade still celebrates the battle as a testament to the Legion's ethos of honor, fidelity, and sacrifice. The survivors, when they gathered in later years, would raise their glasses to the 97 who did not return. Today, the site of Bir Hakeim is marked only by a simple memorial, a cross erected by the French government in the 19th. The desert winds have long since erased the trenches and the shell craters. The minefields have been cleared. The well still produces its brackish water, just as it has for millennia. But the story of those 144 men surrounded without water, facing certain death, remains one of the most extraordinary examples of human endurance and military courage in the annals of the Second World War. They held because they had to hold. They survived because they refused to die. And they escaped because the human spirit, even when parched by the desert sun and battered by enemy fire, is capable of miracles. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to All Y Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.